Okay, guys. Hello and welcome. And today we're going to change subject a little bit and talk about labor and the life and of many of the workers who were involved in this industrialization movement and its benefits as well as some of its negative aspects of it. And so we're talking about the impact of the mechanization of labor. And so this means that machines are now being used not to completely replace individuals, but to make their work much, much, much more efficient and faster. And so one of the things is that machinery allowed more work to be done by fewer people. And right away, you're going to say fewer people. Well, so that means that in this case, a machine took your job. Before we've heard things where a computer might take your job, and we see some of those at some of the self-serve kiosks, for example. I know that you go to Vaughn's, you can have a self-serve checkout type of thing, and so that would be an example of a computer taking your job. So this is nothing new, really, that we're experiencing now. And so the machine just allowed one person to do what many, many more would need, and obviously this is going to contribute to unemployment. And one of the really, really, really big shifts, and I know for us, this sounds like, well, of course you get paid by how long you work, but that didn't always be the way that it was. It wasn't always how it was. Employees just began to be paid by how long they worked as opposed to what they produced. Now, what they produced, we'd call that piecemeal. So if you produce five chairs, let's say you're making a chair maker, you produce five chairs, you get paid for making five chairs. But if you work hourly, well, if you produce, three chairs, then you get paid for how many hours you work. If you produce 10 chairs, you get paid for how many hours you work. And this really is the shift between someone becoming an employee, meaning you're working for someone, they're paying you for your time, instead of being self employed, where they pay you for the finished product. And that is a tremendous shift. What added to this issue was mass production. Machinery was increasingly used, and it contributed, obviously, was a huge part of mass production. And one of the really bad things about mass production, of course, there are many good things too. Obviously, with mass production, you can produce way, way more of any particular product. Take clothing for example. Before mass production of clothing, almost everything was made by hand. And how many shirts and pants and etc. can you make by hand as opposed to make as machinery. And so there's a lot of good things about mass production, and we'll certainly talk about that. But focusing on how it affected the individual person, the actual worker. And so what mass production did, it divided the process of manufacturing into many smaller tasks. And each task was performed over and over and over and over and over all day long by an individual worker. So in this case, think of what we'd probably call an assembly line, something similar to that. And of course, after the individual task was complete, the product moved on to the next stop, and in this case on the assembly line, and the worker did the same thing over and over and over again. Now, if you compare this to, let's say, being self-employed, where you're working on your own time and your own conditions, and you get paid for what you produce, for many workers, this new way of working was really demeaning. Any pride or joy that you would have, as an artisan, making things out of your hand, making things from your hands. Just taking, for example, using the chair maker, taking example, looking at a piece of wood, and at the end of the day, you had formed it into this beautiful chair, and all that was just stripped away. Any pride or joy is stripped away, and the working conditions, they were harsh and strict working conditions, and it just was not a life that was filled with sun and joy and happiness. Um, Even in some cases, people were not allowed to speak to anyone during work because that would get in the way of working, and constantly being monitored. And by the way, I know we're not really talking too much about um, Marxism or anything like that, or communism, but this is a criticism that Karl Marx uses to condemn capitalism. And the reason why this Karl Marx appeals to a large portion of people during the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, is because of the terrible working conditions. And people are saying, "Gee, man, this guy has a point." So that's something to think about. All right, so the changing face of the workforce. Um, of course, employers want to reduce costs because employers, if they reduce costs, they make more money. And so, in an effort to reduce costs even more, employees started hiring women and children since they could pay them less. You say, well, why could they pay them less? Well, the at least idea was if you're a woman or a child, you have someone else, a man, taking care of you, so you don't really need the money to survive. Now, of course, we know that was obviously not true, um, but that I guess truth didn't really matter. I can't really explain that one. But women and children earned about $1.60 for a 70-hour week, whereas men earned $7 to $10 for the same amount of work. 70 hours, by the way. Full time, typically we consider full time 40 hours of work a week. So we're talking almost double. Children were used for menial tasks. Of course, menial meaning very boring, non-productive. Just you don't really gain any skills per se. So it's not like an internship where you're actually learning some very useful skills. And parents allowed their children to work to earn supplementary income. Now, of course, the big thing is that if children were working during the day, that means they are not in school. And why is that important? Well, let's just see. If you look at here, the unemployment rates, and here are the earnings. Now, I know this is from 2016, so it's not exactly the absolute news, but it's still pretty new. So if you have a PhD, 1.6% or 1.6 unemployment versus high school diploma 5.6. And if you have no diploma, 7.4. And then if you look at the difference in weekly earnings, let's say you have 504 at the lowest versus this is more than 3 times the amount. And of course, the working conditions are much better. So it really is important to stay in school. And another big thing was industrial accidents. Working in the factory is dangerous for all. It still is not quite as dangerous because there's a lot of safety laws now, but there are repetitive tasks using high-speed machinery. Slightest mistake could cause very serious injury. Think of all the saws and machinery, a lot of moving parts. And what makes things even worse is that for those who suffered injuries, there was not disability or unemployment insurance. If you got injured on the job, sorry, even if it was not your fault, it didn't even matter. You could be minding your own business and the roof collapses and breaks your leg, and then, oh, sorry, your fault, you're fired. You can't work anymore, which is just ridiculously unfair. But apparently, the owners, I guess, right to make money I guess superseded the individual's right to live and feed their family. It's really, really one of the saddest things we can think of. Now you say, well, come on, how can that possibly be? Who would ever accept that? Well, at the time, the working conditions were justified using the canard. There's a nice word that you should look up of freedom of contract. And so according to the owners of the factories, freedom of contract implies that the employee has a right to sell his labor for whatever wage he can earn, just as an employer has a right to purchase what he deems for a fair price. And so this made the relationship much like a buyer and seller relationship at stores today. Here's what I'm selling. If you don't like the price, you can go to a different store. And if you're trying to get a job, here's what I'm paying you. If you don't want to work for this amount, you can go try to find a different job. But the reason why that's not true, or the reason why that was, I should say, the reason why that's very unfair, is because the supply of workers was so high and demand for workers was relatively low. And according to supply and demand, well, your wages are going to remain low for all but the most skilled workers. And finally, we'll take a look at three labor court cases, and the court certainly has changed many ways in that it views labor court cases now. But at the time, and these are all going to be important ones, Holden versus Hardy, miners' working hours were allowed to be regulated because mining was so dangerous. Lochner versus New York, a law limiting bakers' hours was overturned because baking was not dangerous enough. Muller versus Oregon, a law limiting the hours of women who could work in laundries was upheld because women's well being was necessary to preserve the strength and vigor of the race. Okay, thank you so much.